that was probably my biggest detriment. My Achilles heel was my perfectionism, for sure. And that's why I was unwilling to accept this problem. But just sort of embracing all of that had, I think, allowed me to grow into something that I never even imagined.
Today, we're talking about authenticity, personal growth, and finding your path in veterinary medicine. Welcome to Vet Life Reimagined. Our guest, Rachel Teichberg, has amazing energy and will lift your spirits with her realistic positivity about the veterinary profession. Rachel shares her journey of how she decided to not pursue her childhood dream of vet school and discovered an entirely different path in veterinary medicine that fit her better than her original plan ever could. But getting there wasn't easy. In fact, it took a scary wake-up call to realize something had to change. Today, Rachel serves as the head of education and program development at Veterinary Growth Partners. She is also the co-host of the VetMed Mind podcast, which shares stories of personal success in veterinary medicine. Rachel shares how she learned to break free from perfectionism, navigate a chronic illness, and ultimately find her true calling in veterinary medicine, just not in the way she originally imagined. So let's get to the conversation with Rachel Teichberg.
When did you know that you were even interested in veterinary medicine?
That's a great question. I knew from a very early age, I would say. I was always very interested in animals. They always sort of drew my attention. I was that kid that just wanted to be petting, the random dog on the street. Of course, begging my parents for a pet. But more vividly, I actually remember when I was it must have been kindergarten, we had a class pet and his name was Thumper, who was a rabbit. And it was one of those things where I don't even know if they still do this anymore in school. I'm not sure. But at the time, the class sort of rotated who got to keep this pet, weekends and things like that. And I remember being so excited when it was finally on the weekend, and we set up this whole room for this rabbit who says we had no idea where to put it. So it really had our entire dining room. And there was a picture of me at that age where Thumper is just kind of doing his thing. And I'm just sitting watching him. I'm just sitting there just and so I think the interest in animals was really always there. Whenever anyone used to ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, that was always my answer. I always wanted to be a vet. And so it was just sort of an innate thing. I never really considered other career opportunities when I was little. And mine was very focused on that. I just wanted to work with animals. And so at the time, that was really the only way I knew how. So that was my one career path. So it was just very much so that. But I went through a long period where I thought that I couldn't do that. So I was lost for a little bit as I was getting older, more when I was in college and stuff. I started with I don't know what I'm doing with my life. So I did always want to do it, but then there was definitely a very large part of my life where I was sort of convinced otherwise. So that was sort of an interesting twist, I guess.
Completely understandable, but may I ask just a little bit more about that? What was it that you were hesitating on? Because you said can't.
Yeah.
So what was it that you felt you couldn't do?
Well, the stories that were sort of told to me when I was a kid were a lot of, okay, oh, you want to be a vet, right? And this is when I'm 7 or 8. I was what do you want to be when you grow up, right? And you're oh, well, you have to work really hard. You have to get really good grades. And, all of the things that are kind of not necessarily encouraging. And I don't think anyone meant anything bad by it. But it was sort of I was always met with a lot of that sort of natural resistance. It's really hard to get in and you got to be, again, perfect grades. And I did really well in school, but I wasn't that person who wanted to get A's and everything or was that level driven when I was in middle school and high school, so I felt very sort of deterred from that profession because of what a lot of people were saying. And then also there wasn't necessarily a lot of support in it when I was younger where, for instance, if I had said that to somebody to be well, why aren't you what if we could, explore a day in the life? Maybe you could shadow an animal hospital and really see what that's like, So I kind of committed to a career without really ever seeing what it looked like up until that point. And the stories I was being told was I had to be this perfect person, this perfect student. It's really hard to get into. So kind of why bother? So in high school, I was not very driven into a career path at that point, high school independence. So often living just, your day-to-day life, more concerned with the drama around whatever. And then in college, that's when I like really felt lost. And so I knew I always enjoyed science. I knew I didn't want to be a researcher. I didn't want to be a teacher. And again, I didn't necessarily have a lot of guidance. And so my freshman year, sophomore year, I was undecided. And I just I took everything. I was like, I was like one of those kids that would like find something that speaks to me. And I really didn't find anything. And then at the end of my sophomore year, where it was like kind of time to officially declare a major, I was sort of like, I just don't know what I'm going to do. And it was that only then that one of my friends was like, well, if you could pick anything, like if you could do anything, what would it be? And I was like, well, I remember sitting at this table at dinner, like so moved. Like, she's like, if you could do anything, like what would it be? And I was like, well, I always wanted to be a vet. And she was the first person ever who was just like, so why don't you do that? And I was like, what's that? What? Like, it was like the first time like really anyone ever challenged this whole story of like, it's too hard. Why bother? You got to be perfect, And so I was like, yeah, like why not? It was just ingrained that really just wasn't a possibility. So that was where I started back on that path of studying biology, starting to work in animal hospitals, and like actually exploring this career that I was always really drawn to and pushing forward. And again, having that sort of like laser focus on going to vet school and not necessarily at that time exploring any of the options that were available to me. So I compared to, I think, a lot of people in our industry, started relatively late on my vet journey because of that. Like, I didn't even work in an animal hospital until I was probably like 20. Because again, I was in college and starting my sophomore year or, starting my junior year. So I kind of had that late start into the industry. But I went all in, got my bio degree. I was super, super focused on going to vet school. And so I worked in animal hospitals when I was in college, and I went to Northeastern. They have this great program there where you actually earn college credits while you're working. So you actually alternate semesters. So you can get up to a year and a half worth of outside real working experience, basically without pausing your degree. Like, you're still getting credit for it. You're an active student, but you're gaining connections, you're able to work. And so I don't have to take classes at the same time. So that was really great. So I was actually able to work in a few different hospital settings and actually like be there as a full-time employee. So I started to be a technician and I started to gain experience, started from the kennel, had some great trainers along the way, graduated college. I was working in a general practice. And that was where the first time I started to be like, wait, is this really the right move? Again, and that was really the first time ever where I felt like I was truly making my own decision, like critically thinking about what I wanted to do here. Then, I just got out of Northeastern. I had already over $100,000 in student loan debt because I had no support. And also, and again, not in a negative way, just, my family didn't have the funds to support me through that. I had to take out loans. I also wanted to go to a sort of name brand school because I planned to go to vet school and felt like that meant something to someone. And I was suddenly like, this is the right move. And so my husband and I were about to get married and, vet school could put you anywhere. And so I was like, is this really the right move in that regard? Like, as a newly married couple, we've been together for a really long time, but, to move to a new city, to start over, for me to basically disappear for at least 4 years and him to just like work in a place that he doesn't know anybody and start over himself. So I started asking some questions. And I started asking doctors that I'd worked with in the past, that I was working with at the time, and trying to get some advice. And very sadly, when I asked this question to a good handful of vets, if you had to go back and do it again, would you go? Like, do you feel like going to vet school is a good decision? I know you see where this is going. And the majority of them said no. And that was super discouraging. And that was really the first time where I had that real conversation about what being a vet was really like. Because even as a technician, like I was also still very young, very self-centered, living in my own bubble, not necessarily thinking about what this experience is like for the doctor on the other side. Like we work together, but I wasn't taking into consideration the student loan debt, the stress of the job, the actual schooling, like all of that. And so it really made me hesitate. And I decided not to submit my application. And then I call it my quarter life crisis because I was right about 25 when this was happening. And yes, I plan to live to be 100. So my quarter life crisis, I was like, well, now what do I do? So that was really a turning point for me then too. And right in that moment was when practice manager position in my practice became available. And at first I ignored it. And I was like, it's just going to go to someone else who she's been here a long time. Like, whatever, it's fine. And then I was like, no, you know what? No, I'm spiraling. I don't know, but I feel like I could do that job. So I just put my name out there and I was like, hey, I don't know if you already chose this person, but like, just know I'm interested. And I feel like I'd be really good at this. And I ended up getting that position. And so that was also like the next sort of like turning point. So yes, sorry, it's a long story. You know how these like sort of life journeys go. Yeah.
And so you said you thought that you would be good at the job of manager. Can you verbalize like what you saw in yourself and what you saw in that job that you thought you could do well?
Yeah. So I knew that I could do more. I came from, prior to working in that practice, also like a much higher volume, many more doctor practice. And so I was coming from a place prior that very high pace. And I actually remember moving into this new job and feeling that shift where things were a little bit more stretched and in a good way. Like we spent like a lot more time with our client. And then of course, like moving into the business side, like we were a very successful practice. It just, things were different, you know, like the staffing levels were different, all that sort of stuff. And I just felt like I had the capacity to do more. I felt like I wanted to give myself a chance to challenge myself. And I find that that's something that I enjoy doing all the time. Like I like learning new things. I don't know if at the time I was super aware that that was something that really does interest me, but I really do like approaching a new challenge and trying something new. I also knew then especially when I was thinking about new career moves for me, like as I was like, okay, like I'm not going to be a vet. It was something that I felt like I could try on for size and like see how I could do in a role like that. You know, I know that I'm an organized person. I know that I like to follow process and rules and things like that. I had good relationships with my team members. I've also had the luxury of seeing a lot of really great managers and working with a lot of really great managers over time. And so I was like, I feel like this is something that I could do. And I think that, you know, in hindsight, this was the right practice to sort of get my manager sea legs because it was really well managed. I had a good relationship with the owner. We had a solid staff, some people that were there for a long time. You know, we weren't necessarily facing any like big problems where I felt like I had to walk into sort of like a dumpster fire and like that I maybe wasn't necessarily equipped for at the time. And so it was a really nice entryway. And I felt really safe at that practice. Like everyone knew me. There was the level of respect. It worked out in the perfect way because I was able to grow into a position without a lot of conflict or pushback from team members who were my coworkers and, you know, moving into sort of a leadership role. So I knew that I could do more. And even though I wasn't necessarily even sure at that moment that I wanted it, like as in a career path, it was like the timing was right. And like literally at night, I was like looking up like master's programs and like physical therapy stuff. Like, what do I do now? Like, I was literally just like, I don't like, meanwhile, like I'm working in a hospital that has like all these other job opportunities that like, you know, when you're so focused on this one thing and that's gone, you're just kind of like, I don't even know what to do. So here I took this job just being like, okay, it's available. I know that I could do this job. Let me go with this and then we'll figure out the next part. And I had never really in that moment thought this could be the thing. And so it turned out that I really did enjoy the business side.
Yeah. And that was actually going to be my next question is, you know, you end up finding, oh, wow, like I like business. And so what were you starting to get involved in? And do you remember a time when you're like, I'm having fun?
Yeah.
Like, what were some of those things? And yeah, if you have a story about it too, because those are always fun.
Yeah. Well, I remember like I said, it was kind of like a nice transition, right? I was able to kind of move into that role, taking on more responsibilities. I do remember my first staff meeting, and feeling like this was my chance to kind of like do it differently, to have that conversation with the team. And I like remembered preparing. I made an agenda, and I just like wanted it to be, you know, I wanted to own this moment a little bit, and also just have that conversation with the team, because I know like it is different. Like here I am suddenly, you worked with me before, now that like my role shifted a little bit. And so I do remember doing that. I remember having my first difficult conversation with an employee, and that was really like wanting to vomit feeling. I was underprepared for that because, like many of us, right, I was promoted into this position and I wasn't like put through leadership training. I wasn't put through manager training. I was given this role, and then you're just responsible for all of the things, right? And so it was
The
really
next
a
day.
trial by fire. Yeah, it really was. Thankfully, my husband at the time was working in human resources, so he was a great, amazing resource to me. Like honestly, he was so great because like anytime anything happened, like he was a text away. So what do I do? Is this right? You know, I remember being so worried about, again, all of those rules, like regulatory stuff that, or, you know, like DEA, which obviously he knew nothing about, but like, you know, recruiting and saving files appropriately and like, you know, all of that sort of stuff. All of it was sort of new and challenging. The finances were something that was very new to me. I'd never seen a profit and loss statement before. And that was something that sort of grew over time and more so into like my next role after that. But those were things that I never got to think about. But it was very cool to start thinking critically about the practice, having my voice heard as far as what could we do, what ideas we have, how can we change this process, how can we be more efficient, and like really making change. And that felt really good. We're doing things that are just actively making a difference, whether it be in the client care, the patient care, the employee experience. And it was really nice to see a lot of that come to life in practice.
Yeah. It's so funny as you're saying that. And then, you know, now you teach conflict management and then more
Exactly.
intelligent. So a little foreshadowing there. But also, I think it was about this time that you have another part of your life impacted. And so do you mind sharing a little bit about your health challenge around this time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I moved out of general practice. It was time for a change. My husband always wanted to move to Florida, and he always wanted to move to Miami. It was kind of his dream. I had pushed back for many, 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 many years. And finally, we decided to make the move. And so I ended up getting a job down in Miami as practice manager. And I remember being like, okay, this is my first, like, they don't know me job, right? They're hiring me. What I love about recruiting from within in an animal hospital is there is that sort of safety net where like people know who you are, they know your values, they know your integrity, they know what you're capable of, right? So there's that safety net of trust and belonging that already exists. And here I was hired outside, so I had super imposter syndrome. Yeah, I was qualified and I never lied to anyone about anything, but it was still just kind of like, oh my God, what is happening? You know, like who did I convince that? There was so much of that feeling, right? So stress was already starting to build up in anticipation of starting this job. There was also a lot of excitement, of course, because again, big challenges. I love being challenged. And so I was very excited about all that. And then of course, the move to another state. We did all of that. So job change, move to another state, which I think are like two of the top 3 most stressful things people can do in their life. So we did them at the same time and moved to Florida, started this new job, jumped right in, and it would like crazy town. I started to feel unwell pretty early. And so again, whether it be part of the move, the stress of the job, I think with a combination of everything that just sort of caught up to me. And I find that even now, years later, a lot of that stuff hit me like a wave after the fact, sort of like an aftershock of an earthquake, right? Like you go through this like big traumatic thing and you're like, ah, and then you're like, oh, okay, I feel better. But then you're like, wait, I do not feel good. And like a little bit later, right? It's like almost like your body, once you kind of calm down, there's like that after And I think that that's what was happening to me too. I was living in a very stressful environment with work. And then I had that sort of like follow up. So within like the first 6 months of working at this new job, I started to have significant fatigue. My hair was falling out. I was weight. I wasn't sleeping. I was having fevers like that. It was just things were falling apart. I was having a lot of joint pain and discomfort. And so I finally went to a doctor, and it turned out that I was diagnosed with lupus, which is an autoimmune disease where essentially my immune system mistakes my body for foreign, right? So it attacks like my internal organs, joints, things like that. And that's what causes a lot of the inflammation, pain, and all that. So I didn't realize that I was actually like kind of in my first lupus flare up, where all of these symptoms I was having were because my body was having this big flare. So went to a doctor, and they were, they told me what was going on. And I was like, okay, so what are we going to do about it? Put me on some medications. Great. And I pretty much decided that I don't care about this diagnosis. And which, there's some power in that, but also there was a lot of denial. I would say at this point in my life, there was more denial than empowerment about it. And I decided to just say, okay, great, we're going to take medication and then like just continue on with my life and essentially make zero change. I also wanted absolutely nobody to know about this. I felt at the time like it was going to be, people were going to judge me. People were going to potentially take away opportunities from me. They were going to find me to be less capable, or, I just wrote these stories in my head, right? Based on no fact, just what I felt like having a potentially debilitating disease could do, right, to my relationship, my career, and all that stuff. So I basically was like, great, just going to take medicine every day, go on with my life, and ended up in a hospital. So that happened one time very early on. And, again, didn't tell anybody why I was there. It was just sort of one of those things. They knew that I was in the hospital, but I didn't want people to think about me different. And so I kind of like silently suffered for a really long time. The medications weren't really working because I wasn't actually changing anything in my life. And so the stress of the job and the level of work, my inability or lack of desire really to communicate what was going on in my life wasn't helping at all. I had zero boundary. I was like the yes queen. I was happy to do all of the things and never asked for help. So I was really kind of digging my own grave, honestly. And things just continued to go downhill for me medically because I just wasn't allowing myself to get better. And then, kind of fast forward a couple of years of me just kind of like ups and downs and trying to manage this and, essentially being in chronic pain. I ended up once again in a hospital because I literally couldn't breathe. I was having severe pleurisy where, like the lining of your lungs basically becomes inflamed. And so every breath is like painful. And that's what I got myself to. Like I literally got myself to a place where I couldn't breathe anymore and ended up in the hospital for about a week. And the turning point for me where I was like, really, this is like my aha moment was when I was in my hospital bed, literally tube, drip, the whole nine, husband sitting next to me, full blown doing payroll. And yeah, that was my moment. And honestly, it wasn't even in that moment. I remember my husband, Mike, was giving me a hard time about it. He's like, what are you doing? Just ask somebody for help. Why are you doing this? Like, look at you. What are you doing? And I was like, but if I don't do this, I can't risk everybody not being paid and blah, blah, blah. Did I ever ask anybody if they could just cover it for me while I'm literally in a hospital bed? No. I just felt this huge amount of responsibility that I was, again, if I had asked for help or said I couldn't, what does that mean? And what does that say about me? What does it say about my ability to do the job, my career opportunities, yada, yada, yada. And so I did the payroll. And then it was sort of after the fact that we were kind of, we were there for a while thinking and reflecting. And, it really struck me like, none of his friends are in hospital beds. This isn't normal. Like, this can't be right. And so, and it's funny because I feel like I hear this story back and I'm just like, what were you doing? Why did you let this continue? Like, and again, making honestly zero effort to change my circumstances in any way. I could have done so much without necessarily saying what was going on in my medical life, but I didn't. I was so afraid, I think, honestly, that all of this was just going to slip away. And I don't know. I don't know what I really thought. And, I had people in my life that, as leading up to this moment, being like, this is what somebody said to me, why don't you just care less? What does that even mean? I'm sorry, like caring about my job or about my life or about the people around me, it's not like a dial I can just turn down when I am just like, let's just dial down the caring. I was like, I don't know how to do that. And so at the time, because I really didn't feel like I had any of the tools or skills or ability to actually communicate what I needed, I finally decided to give my notice. And it was a much harder decision than you think, given my medical situation, because I, again, felt like I'm giving up, I'm quitting. I couldn't do it. Like, this job beat me. That was honestly like how I felt. I felt like I lost, that this was a challenge. Again, like, I love challenges. I love them. And I felt like this one I just could not do. And I had a lot of serious feelings about it. And so I gave my notice, really with the reasoning of, and not that this was what I said to them, because again, this was so private at the time. I was unwilling to say anything. But in my mind, I needed to take a break. I needed to just not work. I needed to get my health in order. And I needed to figure out how I can still have a career that I love while also just managing this illness that should not and cannot, and I would not allow to define my life or become this thing. It's just this thing I have to live with, but it cannot become my life. And so that's exactly what I did. So I gave him my notice and I took 5 months off to get healthy, figure out what went wrong, what needed to be changed in any future relationship that we could then be more successful, right? That I can manage my health and also have a career that I love, that challenges me. And I was like, I know that there's a way to do this. And so that's really when I got to work on figuring all that out.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's hard, I'm sure, to kind of say all your thoughts in a 5-month period of time. But, what were some of maybe the high points that allowed you to feel comfortable to start a new job again, or maybe identify the job? Because I think you said, after this is when you found kind of a dream job.
Yeah.
So what had you come to be able to identify that?
So I knew that I needed flexibility. That was one of the first things that I needed. I needed to be able to have a job that I could prioritize my health. That was number one. And I worked with BGP when I was in that last job. So one of the things that we do at BGP is have one-on-one coaching. And so I worked with a coach. And so BGP, the company I work for now, was a part of my life then. And there was a moment toward the end when I knew that I was going to be leaving, that I had my conversation with my coach, Julia, who's the director of coaching now. And I noticed on the caller ID that her number came in from Indiana. And I knew that they were based in Texas. And so it was just one of those moments. She called me a million times before that, and I had never noticed. And so I asked her, I was like, I thought that you guys were in Texas. And she was like, oh, yeah, well, the company's based in Texas, but I actually work and live in Indiana, the remote position. And literally, I swear you could see the light bulb go off over my head. I think, what? Because again, this was suddenly just mind blown, full new possibility of career presented itself to me and again, I had talked to her on the phone before a million times. I just never even connected the dots. And suddenly it was oh, interesting. So VGP and that opportunity came to me at the perfect time, because again, working from home would give me a lot of that ability to focus on my health, not have the stress of driving in traffic. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to Miami, but it's bad. Traffic is bad. so
I've heard.
Yeah, ugh, it's terrible. So just right off the bat, knowing that like that was an option was very, very important to me. And then also, again, just culturally. So I actually, working with Julia and a couple other members of the team at that time, I had them come down prior to that to actually do a talk for my local practice managers group. So, I'm kind of familiar with the kind of work that they were doing outside of just coaching, and that the education side was really interesting to me. But more than anything, it was really like the values and how well we synced up on, what the organization's values really were and what mine were. And a big part of what I was doing in that 5-month period is also figuring out exactly like who I was and what I need outside of just, the ability to manage my health and make that a priority in my life, but also what I need in a working environment and what I need to do differently. I mean, there were countless lessons learned from that last job that at the time were really hard lessons to learn. I mean, literally the hardest way. A hospital bed is probably the worst way to learn a lesson, but I learned them, and I knew that I had to do things differently. Like without question, I know deep in my soul, I never want that to come to be ever again. And I will do everything that I can to avoid it. And so those 5 months were spent exploring what that even meant. That was my first time I started looking into what emotional intelligence was, which I honestly, prior to that, had never heard of before. And again, something like I teach now. I read my first Brene Brown book during that 5-month period, So again, like talk about like tears and like the whole thing. And so I really started to reflect internally, where up until that point, I just never did, because in sort of like the nicest way to say this about my life, like things were fine. Like it wasn't like there hadn't been any like big life challenges that butted up against what I had been doing. I hadn't been presented with this kind of issue before about boundaries or communication or things like that. And so it really forced me to like hold up a mirror and be like, okay, I can place blame on all of the people that I worked with and all of the issues that there were. But at the end of the day, I realized that playing victim served me in no way, that I had a lot of responsibility I could have been taking, a lot of things I could have done that I didn't. And so once I sort of took all of that responsibility and said, okay, like I played a part in this, because there was a lot of like, this happened because, job, then this, right? Like all these outside things, not really taking any responsibility for my action or inaction. So there is a lot of like work that had to be done. And again, continuously, I think that's the thing about like a self-work journey, right? Like there's no end point. I am constantly sort of being presented with challenges as far as like how I handle situations and how I am truly living that balance of work and life and making sure and being more aware when they're really not in check anymore.
Yeah, sometimes our biggest challenge is ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
And like you said, it's a constant thing. And it's good that you still identified with the place that you were working, and maybe it even helps you kind of be able to find your own values and see that they were matched. And so the dream job, it was remote, so that's helpful.
Yeah.
What else about it? Because was this job next working with the coaching side of things and the education?
Yeah. So the first job that I had at VGP was as a practice coach. And so when I came on the team, it was still on the newish side. I think I was the 4th coach to join the team. And what was exciting about it was that it was this big growing opportunity, right? Like we were really still developing a lot of new processes and how we want to do things, creating a ton of resources for our members. So like we were like in real growth mode, which was really, really fun. I loved working with members. I still love working with members, but I had started when I was in practice, and so that job that I had in Miami, one of the things, like I mentioned, I did was started a local practice managers group with a couple of other local PM. And what was really fun about that was, right, we were able to, one, get the practices together locally, where prior, everyone's, there's that kind of culture sometimes in VetMed of like, we can't talk to each other, like, I don't want to share my secrets and all that sort of stuff. So it was nice to create a little community, to bring in presenters, speakers, get just support for all of us, right? That education I didn't get when I was a new manager. That was kind of what I was craving. And so VGP was providing that. And so it was just a beautiful combination of, okay, I get to help other practices, which was so meaningful to me. And it was something that I used to try to do right on my spare time that now I get to do like for my profession. And it was just so incredibly rewarding. And it still is so rewarding to help members achieve their goal, right? This isn't about me. This is about, what's going on over in your practice. What do you want? What are your dreams? What are your vision? What was great about that job too, in working and supporting other people, it also provided me a great lens to reflect on my own experience, right? Because I share so much about what I did in practice and all the mistakes I made in practice, but also the changes that I've made since. And so being able to use that experience to support them and also kind of likewise fold that mirror up, something that I really wasn't getting when I was kind of in the thick of it and like the worst of it, rather than just putting my head in the sand and just like pretending that nothing was happening. It felt really, really nice to finally open up to people, share the mistakes that I made, right? And just, again, kind of embrace that perfectly imperfect kind of way of thinking about myself, right? You don't have to be this perfect person. It's okay. Like we've all made mistakes. And so just being able to lean into that, and a lot of my own personal self-growth had happened through working with other practices. And of course, through speaking at these conferences. And a lot of that is the vulnerability that I want to share to create that sense of safety and belonging. Because again, when I was in practice, that perfectionism thing, that was probably like my biggest detriment. Like my Achilles heel was my perfectionism for sure. And that's why I was unwilling to accept this problem, this big health problem. It was like, no. That doesn't fit into my perfect idea of, right, what my career looked like and what my life looked like and what my relationships looked like. But just sort of embracing all of that had, I think, allowed me to grow into something that I never even imagined. So it's been a really beautiful journey. And yeah, like I said, VGP and my values align so well. We have a value about continuous growth and learning. So I get so much joy from learning new things, even outside of our industry. Like that, like I just am curious by nature and I like to learn. And so a lot of finding this sort of like perfect place has a lot to do with that value system. And also just like we have fun. Like we're a group of people that enjoy being together, even though we're not very often, but even just virtually being together, these are people that I consider to be friends. Like it's just a wonderful group. And so it's just really nice to feel that sense of, like I said, belonging, that safety, that comfort, and that you're with a group of people that are supportive of what you need, where you want to go, and will help you get there. And that's pretty beautiful. So yeah, I feel really grateful.
Yeah, they say the number one thing that retains employees is the ones that feel that they have a friend at work.
Yeah.
And I always think that's really a neat one, is that it doesn't have to be everybody. You have to have at least one person that you feel like there's a friend at work that you could go to. So I think that is really important. The other thing I wanted to comment on is that perfectionist piece. I think that is so common in our profession. So I think we do it sometimes because we're afraid of what other people will think.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a study, I always thought this was an interesting study that they did. They had a model, and she was supposed to be demonstrating a blender. And so I can't remember if it was the same model and different audiences or two different models. But anyway, they had one, and she demonstrated making a smoothie perfectly. And then the other one, they actually asked her to intentionally make some mistakes while she was making the smoothie. And then they pulled the audience on the likability of the model. And the model that had the mistakes actually was ranked far higher than the one who did it perfectly.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to acknowledge that being honest and being a real human being is much more relatable, and people not only like it, but there's a big trust factor too. And it's so much easier to just be yourself.
Yeah. It
don't
was exhausting. And like that, again,
Mhm.
like talk about like here I was trying to pretend the problem didn't exist. And I was like actually making it worse by being so inauthentic and just not being real with anybody about what was happening and what I needed. And you're absolutely right. It was so much work. I describe it as like I was playing the part of practice manager. That's
Mhm.
really what I was doing. Every day I was acting. It was like I had to put this professional version of myself on. And not that I'm not professional, but like whatever my mind said, I envisioned of what this character looked like. That's what I had to be. And I kept everybody in an arm's length. And, those few times where people like tried to peel back the layers, I was just sealed tight. Like there was no getting in to my little like steel cage of protection. So yeah, it was really hard. And it's interesting because it's something that's still in my life. I try really hard to break down. I think that what I realized was that all that experience really did was amplify what was already there, right? I didn't go from this very open, I am an open book person, the most vulnerable person out there, to suddenly being the like steel trap. I think I naturally always had walls, and then feeling like I had something to hide or feeling like I had to prove something to someone just made them just higher, tighter, like, again, I didn't want anyone to see the cracks or that I'm not this perfect person. And so that's still something that I find I have to continue to work on. Like I said, this is a absolute journey. 100%. What I love about now sharing my story and the fact that I've been able to open up about it is that I know that there's people out there that are dealing with something similar. Again, it doesn't need to be medical, but again, whatever that is, whether it be, the connection on the working in a place that maybe misaligns with values, or feeling like you need to play pretend every day to play a part, or that you don't feel safe enough to share some realities of either what's going on in your life, or again, I understand that there's a lot of reasons potentially not to do that, but even just sharing then what you do need, or putting boundaries in place, for recognizing that something isn't right. And even having that moment of awareness. Because again, up until that moment where I was in payroll in a hospital bed, I didn't actually think anything was wrong. Like that, I just felt like I wasn't doing it right. Like I hadn't cracked the code. That's really what I was that's where my head was at. But if I just figure this out, if I just tweak it a little bit more, right? Maybe I'll finally, no, there was no code. But if it's not, right, to be yourself, to open up, to be vulnerable, then find a place that does embrace you for who you are, where you can feel safe, or to do that work yourself, to get to know yourself better. Because ultimately, we spend a lot of time at work. Our lives are short. Let's make the most of it while we're here, right? And again, I deeply want people to stay in an industry that they love. And I know that that's a lot of these things that are going on in people's lives, plus a million other things, are good reasons why people leave, right? They're like, well, maybe this whole industry isn't for me. And I'll say from my own experience, as tempting as that was, I realized that the problem wasn't the industry. The problem was me. I had to fix myself, because I could have gone to any other industry and I still would have suffered the same. So I'm glad that I didn't give up on all of this, that I found my place here in VetMed, even though it wasn't the dream I had as a child. But I'm glad, because that child didn't even know this existed. So I would have blown her mind and been like, you'll never believe what we're doing.
Exactly. And dreams evolve.
Yeah.
The more information that you gather, the more life you live, your changing situation, that can all evolve this dream. And I think that's important to recognize it, to be able to find your happy place. And so, as we're running out of time here, I want to acknowledge you have a really unique perspective. Your job right now is head of learning development. You help multiple hospitals understand, what they need in practice. There's coaching aspects of it. So even on a personal growth level, You've been co-hosting a podcast, interviewing people around the profession about success and, these really cool stories. What has all of this kind of taught you, other than what we've talked about so far, that kind of gives you this optimistic view of the veterinary profession?
Oh man, wow. Well, I am I feel honestly very lucky that I get to work with so many people in the vet industry. What is so true about our industry, and I know that we know this, but every single day I'm just so deeply reminded, is that like we are a bunch of incredibly, deeply passionate people who really want to make a difference. It's so heartwarming. It like gives me all like, like the warm and fuzzies. I just love speaking with our members. The number one thing that they just want to do, like they just want to be better. Like they want to be better for their employees. They want to be better for themselves. They want to be better for their pets. They're so invested in just wanting to be the best that they can be for everybody around them. And it's really beautiful and heartwarming. And I just love that so much. And I love in the podcast too, just hearing about how people came to be where they are. And I love, everybody has a story like mine in the sense of like, it's not a straight line. There's ups and there's downs and there's challenges and there's a lot of serious things that go on. And it's beautiful to see how people have navigated all of that and come out the other side. And there is so much optimism just in that alone, that willingness to stay true to who you are, to believe in yourself and the practice that they're working in, to see a future for VetMed. I love talking to people who are changing the landscape, right? Inventing new products or having these new ideas or publishing books or anything. It's all so inspiring. So I have the most positive outlook on VetMed because we are a group of people who can do anything and are so passionate and compelled to do it. And so I'm excited to see where we continue to go and how we continue to evolve. It inspires me to continue to do my job and to push myself and to see what I can continue to do and, again, find these new challenges for myself and continue to give back to the community in the same way that everyone else is really giving.
Yeah, I think, like begets like in a way. And so the more that we can be surrounded by that, the more it helps us to continue to live that out, which keeps showing that to other people and you hit that big circle.
Yeah.
And so that is important. I'm so glad that you're in that position and you can continue to share that. Now, the final question, you can open it up to everything because I know that there's more. Wow. Yes, we spend a lot of time at work. We're very passionate about our work. There's a lot more to you.
Yeah.
So opening this question up completely, what is something that you are very grateful for right now?
Ooh, I love this question. What am I very grateful for right now? Right now, I will say I am very grateful for my family. I have been fortunate to have gotten to spend so much time with them recently. I was going through some health stuff this whole year. So there were a lot of challenges. I wasn't able to travel. I felt it was almost like COVID again, honestly, is kind of how I felt. But like, oh no, I'm a prisoner. Like it was some serious flashback. And so just in this last couple months, things have started to get a lot better and I've been feeling a lot better. And so I've finally been able to like see my family. And my sister was just in town and we just had the best time. And just getting to spend time with her and my nieces and my nephews, that is what filled my cup. And so when that's taken from me, it is like, it's just awful. And so yes, I am very, very grateful for time I get to spend with my family, the memories that we get to make together. And I wish we could just have all the time in the world together. Forget the job. No, it's just that's everything to me.
That speaks volumes for how passionately you talk about your job. So
yeah.
that's
no,
wonderful.
I And that's just it. Like, I think, again, it just speaks to the connections. Like, the fact, like, the connections I have with my family are so deeply important to me, and equally as so with my job. Like, they fill that same cup, just, from some different ends. But it all of it. I think that's what's most meaningful to me, just in my life in general, and something that I truly, one of my biggest values in those personal connections.